thanks. Welcome, everybody. Today I would like to talk about API design a little bit with Laravel, because at first I would like to know how many of you are using Laravel on a daily basis. Can you give me a short hands up? Okay, quite a lot of people. Hope there is something new in the talk for you, but for the others, all the API design stuff I will talk about today is in general, so you can apply it to every framework, to every language. It doesn't matter at all. Okay, at first, a little bit about myself. My name is Johannes Pichler. I live in Sandl, a small town in Austria. No one knows about this town. I live basically in the woods, so nature around me. I'm a web developer since the year 2006. I've done quite a lot of stuff in PHP, back with PHP 3, I think the first project was. I've also done Go and .NET and Java, a little bit to get some thoughts about it, and also to bring the knowledge over to PHP and to learn more about PHP. And currently I'm working at Wimberger GmbH in Austria. It's a construction company, not very IT related, so we are a small group of IT guys, developers that are building internal applications for our workers and for our office guys. Okay, so why am I talking about APIs? This was me basically 15 years ago. Thinking about who this guy Jason was. I started to integrate third-party APIs, not those well-documented ones that we have today with REST documentation and things like that. It was lots of XML with big, fat Word documents describing each endpoint, the structure of the XML, not XML schema or something like that, just a plain Word document with information in it. But a little bit later, I recognized that APIs are a perfect fit for connecting our applications to the outside world. And 10 years ago, we started a new iteration of our company platform at Karriere.at, my previous employer, and we wanted to follow an API-centric approach. So basically, everything inside of our infrastructure should be connected via APIs. It was quite difficult to get this because Laravel back then was good at doing curl requests, but we built up a big fat API layer, and the first test, I think, from our job listing page took 80 seconds to complete because of this whole stack of API requests that were done in the backend. So this was not acceptable for us because these pages were very relevant for SEO, so the Google ranking was very important for our company. So we needed to bring this speed down to 200 or 300 milliseconds. And to do that, we needed a very generic approach for our APIs. So every endpoint and every single API needs to have the same structure. And this was the point back in time when I thought about API design and how to generalize it and how to define it, that every developer at our company can build up the same APIs as I do. Okay, now the outline for today. At first, I will talk a little bit about designing your APIs, what's important, which considerations you should make. Then we will implement some endpoints with Laravel, and you can see how easy it is to get started with APIs in Laravel. And in the last section, I would like to talk about the verification and maintenance phase, because when the API is deployed, you are live, the clients connect to your API, you are not finished. You need to maintain it, you need to verify your assumptions you made beforehand. Okay, when you look to the outside, there are APIs everywhere, but they are different. API is a very general term. You use it for serving data to your web applications, you use it to connect third-party clients outside of your infrastructure. But these are very different use cases, and they need different handling. Your internal web application may do not need this fully featured REST endpoint with all the meta information and stuff like that. It just needs a view representation that it can easily render out. On the other hand, an external client needs a very well-structured API, a resource document. And so the most important part at the beginning is to consider the clients. You need to clearly think about who is going to use your API. Is it server-to-server communication, or are you connecting mobile applications on a mobile device or a web application to your API? This has a lot of influence at how you need to structure your API in the end. Okay. So, the first thing I wanted to talk when it comes to an API request is the request itself. You should make sure that a request is based on resources. So when you are serving out the construction, for example, as in our case, everything should be named a construction or constructions. In the REST ecosystem, you are always using the plural version. You should use standard HTTP methods for your requests. So a GET request should deliver data to the client. A POST, a PUT request should manipulate data, and a DELETE request, of course, should delete the data. Do not mix those up. It gets very confusing for the clients to implement. Yeah, and please define a clear request schema. So every endpoint in your API should follow the same schema, so it gets easy for a client. Okay, he has used one endpoint from your API, and the second one will work almost the same. And yes, I've seen lots of endpoints with POST parameters. Use easy GET query parameters for filtering, sorting, and stuff like that. Don't make your life hard with difficult POST parameters. Okay, here are examples for a very easy request routing strategy. A GET request to /constructions will deliver a listing. The second one will deliver a detail endpoint, so you pass in an ID parameter, and so you can retrieve a single item. The POST to /constructions will create a new entry, PUT or patch will update an existing one, and of course DELETE will delete the underlying record in your data storage. Okay, another important part is the response section. So when a request hits your server, you're building up responses and sending it back to the client. I've seen lots of these responses. These are the easy ones. So just a single JSON object with all the database attributes in it. And on the other hand, for manipulation requests, you can often see this message, construction saved, or even worse, success is true, or stuff like that. That doesn't make a lot of sense. And the first one is, basically just a dump of your database schema. So a little bit more structure should be applied here. Just by adding this data element around the attributes makes it clear that this is the data that this endpoint is serving. So just by including all the data that is used to define a construction inside a data object makes it clear for the client that these are the attributes of the underlying resource. Also, for manipulation requests, in this case the PUT request, where you update a single resource, should return back the updated data. Because think of it, a client has a form, and you're entering new values, click the save button, and then he gets back, okay, it was saved, and then he needs to fetch again the freshly updated data. And with the data section already in place here in the response, he can directly use it. And of course, if you really want to include this message, you can do so in an additional meta information block, where you can store such messages, or for example, the creation timestamp, the update timestamp of your underlying database record. These are not fields that the user can manipulate with the endpoint, but it is an additional meta information that can be presented here. More response examples. It's always a problem when you have requests outside of the normal CRUD world. You don't want to create or update a database record. In this case, I want to update the construction in my search index, for example, an Elasticsearch index, and there's no real data that is coming back from this post. So I'm sending a post request to constructions/1/index, and there is an index job badged in behind. And in the meta section, I can tell the client, okay, this is the indexing ID and the message, okay, the construction indexing has started. And later on, the client may ask the server again with this identifier, is the indexing process finished or not? But that's not real data because we are on a resource-based approach and meta information that the client may use later on. Okay, another response example. Think of a post request for creating a new construction, and we have validation in place. So we need some sort of mechanism to tell the client, okay, you need to update the data because otherwise I won't accept it. And this is standard Laravel validation with JSON output. So you get an errors object with all the fields that are not valid at the moment, And for every field, you can have one or more error messages. This can be translated, stuff like that, or just simple translation keys, and the client then is responsible for translating these error messages. Okay, to sum up, advices for structuring these responses: please use grouping for your data. Data for all the resource attributes, errors for error information, and a meta block to provide additional information that is not directly connected to the resource data. Next one is also important. Please do not define the response type by the status, by the response structure. This means when you are creating a resource and you're receiving back a 200, a successful status code, the client should rely on that there is a data attribute in it. And if an error comes back, he can assume that an errors object is present. He doesn't have to look if error key exists to check if this or that or this field is available. And of course, there is a big de facto standard for JSON APIs. It's called JSON API. But in my opinion, it's a little bit overwhelming for smaller projects. So you can use it, but you don't have to. I think the structuring with data, errors, and meta information is enough for a good API architecture. Okay, also protecting your API endpoints is an important topic. So I would say it's important to use client-specific tokens by default. So every endpoint should be protected at least at the client level. So every application that is using your API should get its own token. And if you have user-sensitive data in your APIs, use user-specific tokens. In the Laravel world, you can use Laravel Sanctum. This is a package that can be installed, and it is automatically assigned to the user model, and you will get an API token for every single user. You can refresh it, and it can also validate it. Yeah, and last one, you can also use OAuth 2 if you really want to. OAuth 2 is hard. It's hard to understand. But if you have already an OAuth 2 server inside your infrastructure, you may use it to authorize and authenticate API requests against it. Caching inside your APIs. Do not use server-side caching. Because when we look up the REST specification, REST should be stateless, so caching is de facto not allowed. And also in my experience, you have very low hit rates on API caches. So at Karriere.at we had less than 1% hit rates for response caches, and for database caches it was a little bit higher, the number, but in general the hit rates are so low it doesn't matter, it doesn't make sense to cache it. It costs on the infrastructure side, but you can help the client to do client-side caching by using eTags. If you didn't hear about eTags before, it's a simple mechanism where you simply add an eTag header to your responses, to your resource responses, and this header value describes the current state of the resource. It's a hash built up by the identifier and by a timestamp, for example, and the client can keep this eTag header value, and on subsequent requests he sends this eTag value with the request in the if non-match header, and then the API can check, okay, is this header value still equal to the resource current eTag value, and if yes, he sends back 304 not modified header, so the client knows, okay, this content is still valid, the payload size received is very small, and if it's not valid anymore, the API can send back the newly or the new version of the resource, and also a new eTag header value that the client can store again. Okay, lots of stuff about API requests, responses, security, and stuff like that. This should be described first. So please describe your API endpoints before starting to implement them. Also define the edge cases, errors, validation stuff. Please put everything into your API specification. This allows you to test your specification against the implementation and also to document your APIs. And this, in fact, allows all the clients and all the users of your APIs to understand your API endpoints. Yeah, you can you can specify it in whatever form you want, but there is also a standard for describing API documents, and it's called OpenAPI. You can put lots of general information in there, markdown, the authors, the base URL, stuff like that, but most important, the API paths, so the endpoints, and on the other hand, the models, basically the resource items you can define at one place and then reuse it in different paths. I would like to show you an open API model for my construction example. So you can tell in the specification that it's an object, it has different properties with different data types, and you can also define that certain fields are required and certain are not. So this describes my construction resource item, the schema for my model. And on the other hand, you have the paths definition here, an example for a constructions endpoint to retrieve a list of constructions. And I've defined a response 200, so the successful, the happy path, and we will receive a JSON object, the application JSON response with a schema of a data attribute of type array, and all these elements inside the array are following the schema for my construction. And with this specification in place, I can generate documentation on the one hand, and on the other hand, I can validate my implementation against this YAML definition of my API. Okay, now a little demo time. I would like to show you how easy it is to implement the list and the detail endpoint with Laravel. Then I will show you how to implement the simple API token mechanism with Laravel. And the last part will be about implementing the verification against my OpenAPI specification. So you should now see my code editor. Is the font size okay, or should I increase it? Let's go up one step. Okay, we are in a very basic Laravel project at the moment. You can see I've created a migration for a constructions table. So I'm storing constructions in a SQLite database in the back with all the fields I've presented before it. The construction has a name, an order value, started at, the finished at, stuff like this. This doesn't matter at all. And then I'm jumping to my routes file, and here I want to define our listing page. So I will define a get endpoint to /constructions. And then I tell the router to use a construction controller for this endpoint, and it should call the list method in there. Okay, then let's create the controller for me, PHP artisan make controller, construction controller. Let's import it here. Jump over to it, okay, and now let's implement this public function list. And then just receive all the construction items from my model. Construction, all, no filtering or something like that. And just by returning constructions here, Laravel will automatically convert all the models to JSON objects. So switch over to the browser, and you can see, as in the first example shown, all my database fields just spit out in plain JSON structure. And this is not what we want, but it's a start. So we can see it's an array and with all the objects in it. And to give it a little bit of structure, Laravel has the concept of resources. You can also create this with an artisan command, make resource. And then I will call it construction resource. And inside this resource class, I can define the look of my resource object I would like to return to the user. And by default, it's just a call to the parent toArray method, which spits out all the model attributes by default. So we will change this part just to an array. Sorry. And here I can say, okay, I want the ID, the identifier, this ID, some Laravel magic here. It will just call the model instance behind, then also the name field, this name, and of course the order value, this order value. And just by adding this definition, I've now told the resource that these three fields are mandatory, should be printed out when the construction resource is used. and I need to tell the controller method that it should return this resource class. So I just tell construction resource, and it should be a collection of elements, and I pass in the constructions collection. And when refreshing my response, you can see only these 3 fields are represented in my data section. This data section is automatically applied when using resource objects. So the base structuring I told before is automatically applied for me. Yes, so the listing endpoint is basically finished. On the detail one, I will show you the function implementation here. So let's make a function detail. Basically the same, almost the same. So I need to get the construction from the route parameter. So I simply annotate here a construction variable that is passed into my method, and in my route definition, I define a second get route to /constructions/ and then parentheses also the variable name construction, and this should be sent to the construction controller class as well and to the detail method. And with implicit model binding in Laravel, I will receive this identifier converted to the actual model instance, and I can use it in the controller directly here. So I simply tell return a new construction resource instance and pass in the construction model. And when everything is correct, when I add an identifier here, yes, I will get back the single database record represented with the resource class. So fairly easy to build up new endpoints here. Lots of magic, but it's easy easy and fast to build stuff. Okay, second point is now I want to protect my endpoints, and of course we are doing this with middlewares. So let's create one, also with artisan command. I think that's a standard in all major frameworks that you can have CLI commands for different class types, middleware. I will take API token middleware as the name. And when I open it up, it doesn't follow the standard, I think. It's a little bit different than in the PSR standard, but basically it's working the same. It's this onions model, so all the request bubbles through all middlewares, then through the controller, and then it bubbles up again. And here I can intercept the request and can check if a certain parameter is available. So I assign to a token variable the request parameter with the name token, a simple URL parameter for this example, and then I can check if token is not equal to phpday, for example. I can abort with 403 status code. Abort is just the helper function to immediately return a response with the status code that you provide here. Okay, so when I refresh the page, nothing happens because I need to assign the middleware to the actual route, and this can be done in the routes definition just by adding a middleware call here and passing in the API token middleware class. And with this definition, it should already work. So when I go back to the page and refresh, you can see the HTML representation, not quite correct for APIs, but for now it's okay with the status code 403. And when I pass in the token parameter phpday here, I get the correct output I want. And I've successfully authorized my client application to access my API. Very basic approach, but you can add database calls here, make it more elegant for your use case. Okay, and the last part of this demonstration will be about verifying that my API implementation follows my specification I've built up before. So here is my YAML file for the constructions endpoint, the path API constructions, same as before on the slides with response 200. It returns an application JSON with a data property of type array, and it contains this construction schema. And by simply writing a unit test here, Laravel, you have lots of helpers for HTTP testing, so I can make a call to this get /API/constructions, and we'll receive back a response here. And then I can assert on this response that the status is 200, for example. Set status 200. And so let's make this a little bit bigger to actually show the output of my test, composer test. As you can see, this test passes already, so it fakes the request to /API constructions. It builds up a request model for me and checks if the response is having a status code of 200, so should work. And then there is a package by Kirschbaum Development for validating my Open API specification. It's based on the Open API package for validation, so it should also work for Symfony and stuff like that. And in Laravel, I simply use the validates its Open API spec trait here. And with this usage, I'm already finished. So when I start my composer test again, you can see, okay, no additional assertion, but we are green here, so everything should be fine. So when I'm deleting something from my resource here, so I'm removing the order value and testing again, you can see the test gets red, and when we scroll up a bit, you can see there was one failure. Key validation failed, required property order value must be present in the object. So when I'm bringing it back in and executing the test again, you can see it gets green again, and you have a very simple mechanism for validating the specification against your API implementation. Okay, then let's jump back to the presentation. Yeah. Okay, now let's continue with the last part of my talk, the verification and maintenance phase. You have built your API, you have beautiful specification, the documentation for it, the clients start to adopt, to use it, and now it's all about metrics. Please make sure to monitor the usage of your endpoints. Some of them are maybe hit very hard, lots of requests on them, they need to be performant, and others may not be used. So you can make decisions where you have to put more effort in and where you can do less effort in. On the other hand, useful error logging is important. The worst case is that the client calls you and tells you about an API error, so please have error monitoring in your APIs. You are serving data to the outside world, so you need to be the first to know. And of course, you need to verify your assumptions you made during development. You've built up a beautiful specification, you thought about every little detail inside of your API endpoints, and maybe the client does want something completely different, or he needs additional fields. You have too much information in it, so you need to recheck this from time to time if the API endpoints are perfectly fit for the clients. They need that information. And maintaining an API can be quite hard. Okay, it's not working. Breaking changes. So you need to rename a field in your API response. You need to delete fields completely. Think about a simple web application on your side with an API from yourself, and you are removing a field. Your web application will blow up because it displays this information somewhere. And when clients out there are using your API, it gets even harder because you don't have it in your hands that they update to a new version of your API. You need to communicate with the clients. You need to version it somehow. And here you can do this by simply introducing semantic versioning. So you would have a v1 or something like that in your URL. And when a breaking change is introduced, you build up a v2 endpoint, tell the client, okay, there's a v2 now. Please make sure to upgrade in the next 6 months because then the v1 endpoints will be deleted. And so you can keep track of your API versions and keep the clients updated or at least force them to update to a new API version. And also very important, keep your API specification up to date. As always, specification gets outdated when we are doing changes, but if you're using it for implementation testing and also for generating your documentation, you need to update it as well. Okay, so if you're not a Laravel developer or you're not used to Laravel, these are the key takeaways for me. So please, please, please specify your APIs before you implement them. Make a clear picture of what you are doing and then implement against this specification. Secure your API's data. It's the connection to the outside world. Provide proper documentation to your clients. It should be easy to read, very standardized, so every endpoint description should look almost the same. And please be very, very careful with introducing breaking changes to your clients. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you. Thank you. So, if you have questions, raise your hand. If you have any question. One question here. Thank you.
Thank you. We do use OpenAPI spec for generating code, and I do write the whole spec by hand.
Okay.
And it's very easy to get over 2,000, 10,000 lines of specification. And how do you separate the stuff so you don't have 10K lines of code in one file?
I'm using Stoplight Studio for creating my API specifications, and there you can have separate YAML files for a group of endpoints, so the files don't get big like that. So maybe this is an approach, and for the validation, I think you can provide multiple YAML files so that the validator uses all of them, and merges them.
Okay. Yeah. Any other question?
Over here.
Over here. I have one from home also.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi. You say you were not very happy to have a success message in the API. So how would you render a construction successful? Would you have the translation in front end then? Or how would you do that?
Yeah, it depends on the framework you're using, but normally you have a translation key. So you have the English version with dots or something like that, and then the API should send back this translation key. Or some sort of enumeration that the client knows which error message he should display.
Hello.
Hey.
One of the challenges when designing an API is like representing a different, let's say, representation of what the clients need. Like a client, when you have different clients, they need different data, maybe a different representation of the same resource. So have you ever dealt with this problem? Like, there are like several solutions, like what GraphQL does, or similar things like Hydra or JSON LD. Like, did you ever have this problem?
We have had a similar problem because we built up everything with the JSON API standard, and it was hard for the clients to parse this data. So we built up BFFs in between, a backend for front end, to manipulate the representation and make it fit to the client needs. So a layer in between, but the API is still one representation. Yeah. Okay.
Other questions here? One. Meanwhile, I have one from home.
Yeah.
Are you using any library, example the doc scramble, to generate the OpenAPI schema and possibly a web interface, or are you doing it manually?
The documentation, I'm using Redoc for it. So Redoc can be directly integrated, I think, in all major frameworks, and you simply tell it where the YAML file is located, and it generates the documentation for you.
Yes.
Yes.
To protect an API, you put a middleware in each action,
Yes.
basically in the controller. Is it better to have a pipeline, a generic, to validate the security layer, or for each action you validate the whitelist, for example, or?
If I want to protect all endpoints, I would build up a route group for it and apply the middleware to all routes inside this group. And if this is not the case, if every endpoint needs to protect it, you can define it in the kernel of the API definition, and all endpoints are protected automatically by the middleware.
Others? From our clients there. Which library did you use for the OpenAPI specification test?
It's from Kirschbaum Development. I will just open up the composer JSON. Kirschbaum Development Laravel OpenAPI Validator. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not visible anymore, but
no.
Yeah. I will put it in the slides. I put it on speaker deck.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Last one. So you are not using attributes or annotations for documentation and generating documentation for OpenAPI specifications. So you are not using attributes or annotations for documentation and generating documentation / OpenAPI specifications.
No, it's not my approach. I'm not a fan of generating specification out of code. I want to test my code against the specification.
Okay. We have one question.
Hi there. Thank you for your talk. What would be your recommendation for versioning? Like in the path or in the header, or what do we suggest?
We have used a path, so we had the version in the path, but it's hard. It's always hard, but it's at least it's visible in the URL. So I would put it into the path of my URL.
And then you would need to duplicate the routing system to manage that and have different models for each route. And
we had separate deployments for each version. So
those are different applications.
Yes, it was the same application, but two different branches were deployed.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
One last one, I think.
Okay, thank you for your talk. In general, is there a time limit that the endpoints should not be exceed for the response? I mean, I know it's very big answer, but in general, with the web application, there is a time limit. I mean.
For you mean if there is a limitation in timing for API endpoints?
The best timing for responding.
It's difficult. I always rely on Google's time to first byte of about 200 milliseconds, which is okay. But that's a whole bunch of API requests. So yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, I think that's so. I have one last question.
Okay.
Do you think Amarone with the cola for
what?
Amarone, a red wine? No, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Okay. So a big round of applause for Johannes Pichler.